One of the greatest works in the history of philosophy, and the book that laid the foundation for modern economics, happened simply because its writer was bored. Adam Smith was 43 years old when he was hired by a British statesman named Charles Townshend as a tutor to his stepson, a young duke and son of the woman Townshend had just married. Townshend was, in an indirect way, one of the causes of the American Revolution. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man responsible for the taxations that ultimately provoked the colonies to revolt. Townshend had seen some of Smith's writings and knew he was held in high regard by the eminent Scottish philosopher David Hume. He thought his stepson would be in good hands with Smith, so he offered him £300 plus traveling expenses plus a pension of £300 a year thereafter. This was a big increase in the salary Smith was currently receiving as a professor in Glasgow, so he readily accepted. In 1763, he headed off with the 18-year-old Duke to France, where they settled into a house in Toulouse. It was there that Smith, who had spent most of his time in the dynamic cities of Scotland, began to realize he wasn't cut out for life in the French provinces. During the 18 months of excruciating boredom that followed, he thought he might as well write a book to entertain himself. He wrote to his friend Hume, "The life which I led in Glasgow was a pleasurable, dissipated life, in comparison of that which I lead here at present. I've begun to write a book in order to pass away the time." The book was called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, but it's known today simply as The Wealth of Nations. It may have been the product of one man's boredom, but its stimulating influence on later economists has never been surpassed. Adam Smith was probably born a few days before his record of baptism, which is dated June 5, 1723. His birthplace was the fishing village of Kirkcaldy in Scotland, a country that would produce many great thinkers during this period of European history known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, covers the basic time period of the 17th and 18th centuries. It was an age when people turned away from superstition and dogma to rational thought and scientific reasoning. This came about partly because people were weary of all the religious wars and oppression of the previous centuries, and partly because they were inspired by new discoveries in the field of science, such as those of Isaac Newton. As a result, faith was out, reason was in. Some of the greatest figures of the Enlightenment included René Descartes, Voltaire, and Spinoza. Smith's father, a controller of the customs in Kirkcaldy, died a few months before his son was born. His mother, Margaret Douglas, was the daughter of a wealthy landowner. Smith was deeply attached to his mother his whole life. He seems to have had a very traditional childhood, with the rather spectacular exception that at the age of 4, he was kidnapped by gypsies. The gypsies were pursued and finally abandoned little Adam by the roadside, where he was rescued unharmed. It's probably just as well for his kidnappers, for it's hard to imagine that this orderly and concise thinker and economist would have made a very good gypsy. Smith received his elementary education at local schools in his hometown, and then, at age 14, went on to Glasgow for his higher education, where he studied mostly mathematics and Greek. He won a scholarship and traveled by horseback to Oxford to continue his education. Although his mother hoped he'd take up religious orders, instead he studied Greek, Latin, Italian, French, and English literature. Smith wasn't very pleased with Oxford, which seemed rather staid compared to the stimulating atmosphere in Glasgow, one of the centers of the Scottish Enlightenment. Like other dynamic thinkers of his time, he found Oxford professors to be uninspired and worthless. To compensate for this, he decided to educate himself by reading. But just when he was submersing himself into a copy of philosopher David Hume's Treatise on Human Nature, college authorities confiscated it on the grounds it was unfit reading for a Christian youth. Hume was a skeptic who opposed organized religion, and rather enjoyed the fact that he'd been branded an infidel. Smith could endure the stifling atmosphere at Oxford for only a year. Then he was back at home in Kirkcaldy, living with his mother and relishing the freedom to absorb himself in any book he chose. When he was 25, Smith moved to the big city of Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland and a cultural and intellectual center of Europe. There, with the help of connections in his mother's family, he began lecturing independently on literature, rhetoric, and other topics. One of his lectures was entitled Justice, Police, Revenue, and Arms. Lectures were very popular during this era when human knowledge was expanding rapidly, and there was generally a climate of intellectual freedom. Where today a night out might mean a trip to the movie theater, in the 1700s, a night out meant a trip to the local lecture hall. Subjects ranged from history and economy to art and ethics. Although Smith first spoke about literature and rhetoric, he soon began to broaden his scope into what he called the progress of opulence. By the time he was in his late 20s, he was already laying the groundwork for his future masterpiece with an economic philosophy he called the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. As a lecturer, Smith was apparently outstanding. He so impressed the people that count that within a few years he was appointed to the chair of logic in the University of Glasgow. The year after that, he was also made a professor of moral philosophy, which included ethics, law, and political economy. These years, full of energy, creativity, and social and intellectual activity, he later described as by far the happiest and most honorable period of my life. During the week, he lectured early, from about 7:30 to 8:30 in the morning, then again from 11 to noon, 3 days a week. His classes were made up of as many as 90 students at a time, all between the ages of 14 and 16. His subject matter was the type that today would be tackled by graduate students in their 20s. Breaking with tradition, Smith taught his courses in English instead of Latin, which must have made them somewhat easier for his students, although college students at the time were expected to be fluent in Latin. Since Smith was elected dean of the faculty after a few years in Glasgow, his afternoons were spent mostly with university affairs. Evenings, on the other hand, were his own, and he chose to spend most of them in the company of his wide circle of friends, which included aristocrats, government officials, and intellectual and scientific figures. Among them was Joseph Black, a pioneer in the field of chemistry, James Watt, inventor of the steam engine, Robert Fowles, a distinguished printer and publisher who later founded the British Academy of Design, and of course the philosopher David Hume, a lifelong friend Smith had met back in Edinburgh, who was a famous advocate of free trade. He also got to know some of the successful merchants who were carrying on trade with the American colonies, which is probably where he got much of the hard information he needed later to make his book so credible. By the time he was 36, Smith was ready to put some of his ideas into writing and published his first work entitled The Theory of Moral Sentiments. That theory, in a nutshell, stated that a human being's ethics came spontaneously from their ability to sympathize with and put themselves in the position of others. Thus, our moral sense is rooted in our social instincts, our habits as members of a group. In a sense, Smith was describing the role of the superego that Freud defined over 150 years later. The theory of moral sentiments was well received by Smith's colleagues, one of whom even called it the most important work that has ever been written on this interesting subject. It was partly because of this success that he was hired as tutor for the young Duke and was whisked off to Europe to languish away in the French provinces. The fee that came from that position, which included a lifelong stipend, gave Smith all the security and freedom he needed to create his masterpiece, The Wealth of Nations. The stay in Europe wasn't all boredom, as it was broken up by inspired writing. When granted a 2-month vacation, Smith made visits to some of the leading thinkers of France, including Voltaire, who was then living in exile in his estate in Ferney near the Swiss border. The two got along very well. Voltaire was an admirer of Great Britain, which he believed produced so many renowned thinkers because of its liberal government and the atmosphere of free thought. He had made it a point to learn English and had intensively studied the works of Isaac Newton and John Locke. After meeting Voltaire, Smith continued on to Paris, where he was introduced to the great literary salons of the French Enlightenment. That visit was interrupted when the younger brother of his charge, the Duke, became ill and died, in spite of Smith's frantic efforts to save him. After that, both the Duke and Smith returned immediately to London. In London, Smith broadened his circle of friends even wider, to include, among others, the writer Samuel Johnson and inventor, writer, statesman Benjamin Franklin, who was there on business for the colonies. 2 years after he'd left for France, Smith returned to Scotland, where he lived contentedly for the next 10 years, sharing a house with his mother and working to finish The Wealth of Nations. It was published in 1776, when he was 53. The same year, the American Revolution kicked off. Nothing could have been more appropriate. Among the other many ideas of the book was Smith's statement that the colonies, since they were dissatisfied with British taxation laws on restrictions of their trade, should be allowed to form their own nation. He said, "By thus parting good friends, the natural affection of the colonists to the mother country would quickly revive. It might dispose them to favor us in war as well as in trade, and instead of turbulent and factious subjects, to become our most faithful and generous allies." He also predicted that the colonies would someday be one of the wealthiest, most powerful nations in the world. But his writing on America was but a minute fraction of the book. The bulk of it was dedicated to a lengthy analysis of the meaning of wealth and the forces which either inhibit or contribute to the growth of a nation's economy. When David Hume received a copy of his friend's new book, he wrote back, "Beautiful, dear Mr. Smith, I am much pleased by your performance, and the perusal of it has taken me from a state of great anxiety. It was a work of so much expectation by yourself, by your friends, and by the public, that I trembled for its appearance, but now I am much relieved. Being, however, a very candid friend," he also added, "if you were here at my fireside, I should dispute some of your principles." The Wealth of Nations was admired by Smith's friends and his wide circle of admirers, but it took a few more years before it gained wide acceptance by the public. Even though the book went through 5 different editions in Smith's lifetime, its major influence on economic policy didn't occur until the early 1800s. One critic heralded the book as something that would persuade the present generation and govern the next, a prediction that wasn't far off the mark. As an individual, Smith was a surprising person to show such awareness and insight into economic issues. No one could have been further removed from the work of agriculture, industry, and trade than the mild-mannered professor, for whom money had never been a great concern. Smith was a gentle, polite soul, although he was capable of holding his own when his ideas were unfairly assaulted. One occasion when the writer Samuel Johnson made a rude personal criticism, Smith retorted with a 4-letter word that questioned the legitimacy of Johnson's birth. In general, though, he was known for his mildness, and friends of the time liked to describe his benign smile. There is only one portrait of the philosopher. It shows that benign smile, somewhat heavy-lidded eyes, an aquiline nose, and the suggestion of a protruding lower lip. Apparently, he didn't think much of his looks. When taking a friend on a tour of his immense library, which contained over 3,000 volumes, he commented, "I am a beau in nothing but my books." Smith never married, and there's no record he was ever interested in romance. In fact, he lived with his mother until the day he died. But since there's very little information about his life, this doesn't mean he didn't have personal interests which remain hidden. He was very private in some ways. For instance, he seems to have given a large part of his income to charity, but he always kept these generous donations secret. As his death approached, he also had his personal papers and nearly all his manuscripts destroyed. One was on the theory and history of law. Another was on sciences and the arts. According to those who knew him, Smith had many peculiarities. One of them was a stumbling manner of speech. until he grew comfortable with the topic and the audience, and a walk that was described as vermicular, wavy like a worm. He was known, though, for his political tact and his business efficiency, especially in dealing with the sometimes touchy politics of the university faculty. Smith was most famous, however, for his absent-mindedness, which rivaled only that of Newton and Einstein. One Sunday morning he wandered into his garden, wearing only a nightgown, completely engrossed in some philosophical problem. Totally absorbed in his thoughts, he then strolled out into the street and began walking towards the village of Dunfermline. He had covered the 12 miles to town before the ringing of the church bells jarred him from his reveries. Churchgoers arriving for the morning service were stunned to find the renowned philosopher in their midst, but more astonished still to see him in his nightgown. Smith simply turned in his tracks and calmly made his way back home, leaving the villagers something to talk about for years to come. In spite of his eccentricities, Smith was respected and deeply admired throughout Europe. So inspiring a teacher was he that he attracted students from countries as far distant as Russia. In his later years, he was praised by the greatest thinkers on the continent, and his work was increasingly recognized by the British government as a valuable source for practical economic theories. Once he had finished his masterpiece, The Wealth of Nations, Smith went into semi-retirement. He first spent 2 years in London, where he joined a social circle that included some of the most eminent scholars and artists of the time, including the painter Joshua Reynolds. Then he returned to Scotland, where he took a post as Commissioner of Customs and Salt Duties, a post that paid £600 a year. Being an honest fellow, he informed his former student, the Duke, that he would no longer need his yearly pension. The Duke, however, responded that his sense of honor would never allow him to stop paying it. As a result, Smith was very well off in the final years of his life, years that were spent quietly in Edinburgh with only occasional trips to London or Glasgow. In Edinburgh, where he moved in with his mother once again, Smith worked on revisions of his previous writings, though he never again published a new work. Honors and recognitions continued to pour in until the day of his death on July 17, 1790, after a painful illness. He was 67 years old. Smith was buried in a local churchyard with a simple monument that says only, "Adam Smith, author of The Wealth of Nations, is buried here." Adam Smith is known primarily for that one single work. It was the first complete book on political economy. It was the first major work to explore the idea of laissez-faire economics. And it's the work that explained the forces that were changing Europe from a feudal and trade-based economy into one of capitalism and free enterprise. One of the features that made Smith's book so different from all that preceded it was his historical approach. Economic theories before him had been based on problems of the immediate moment, like a crisis in banking or credit or a shift in the balance of trade. Others were speculative in nature. They were based on ideas and propositions that weren't grounded in fact or had no supporting evidence. Smith introduced the historical method of looking at economics, thereby transforming it into a science. Although the style of the book is chatty and friendly, Smith filled it with historical events, backgrounds, and trends from which he could derive his main theories. Among other topics, he traced the historical origin of freedom, the history of Rome, the origin of city independence, the rise of the Third Estate, and changes in war and militias. He also explored the origin of money, changes in prices, the history of the colonies, and effects of imperialism. The second major contribution of The Wealth of Nations was Smith's theory that wealth is the labor of the people who produce it. The book opens with a famous passage in which Smith describes a pin factory. There are 10 people in this factory, each specializing in different tasks, and together they turn out 48,000 pins a day, compared with the few pins, maybe even only one, that each could produce alone. These workers, the people of a nation, were what Smith saw as its real wealth, along with the land and its products. Wealth was not the same as money. It was not the gold or silver that a country possessed, but the labor, services, skills, and goods. This view is what became his famous labor theory of value. The labor theory of value was a daring point of view at the time, since most governments, and especially England, were based on what's called a mercantile system. That is, the wealth of a community was believed to rely only on favorable trade. In a society like that, an individual could gain his money and power mostly by cornering a market which held the most highly saleable goods, like spices, for instance. The government, in turn, assumed it should concentrate on those goods which are always sure to find a market, and the commodity in demand was the means of exchange itself, gold. As a result, countries would hoard their gold, and any ruler or government who hoarded the most had the most power. Because of this system, mercantilism always meant that countries were striving for a balance of trade. That is, more being exported than imported, so a net gain in gold was made. To prevent the outgo of gold, governments passed stringent laws that prohibited foreign luxuries and sometimes forbade the export of gold altogether. They also used tariffs and directed prohibitions to prevent the country from being flooded with foreign goods. The aim of mercantilism had nothing to do with raising the standard of living of its own people, nor contributing to the well-being of other countries. Its only aim was to regulate commerce and industry so that the power of the state was greater than that of other nations. This was the system that Adam Smith attacked in The Wealth of Nations. To Smith, wealth is created by people, and people created by work. Therefore, the wealth of a community increases by the amount of work it puts out, not by the money it hoards. It was his theory that the greatest physical wealth results from the greatest economic liberty. Smith called for an end to feudal tolls, guild restrictions, government regulations, and industrial or commercial monopolies, all of which limited the freedom of individuals to work, spend, save, buy, and sell at their pleasure. The actions that keep production and distribution in motion. This view is called laissez-faire economics, a phrase coined by others before Smith. It was originally the motto of a group of French economists led by François Quesnay, a physician to Madame Pompadour, mistress of Louis XV. Smith had met Quesnay in Paris and was strongly influenced by him. Literally, laissez-faire means to let it happen, to not interfere. In this case, Smith meant that if the individual was left on his own to find by trial and error the work he could do and where he fits in economic life, then things would settle into a natural order and productivity would thrive. As far as Smith was concerned, the government had only three duties: to protect society from violence or invasion, to protect its citizens from injustice, and to maintain public works and buildings that can never be for the interest of any one individual alone. They were the same principles of government that Thomas Jefferson would soon be fighting for in the new United States. To Adam Smith, utopia meant a society in which there was totally free trade. Even though he's been called the apostle of capitalism, Smith always took the side of the worker in his writing, sometimes even sounding almost like Karl Marx. He was angry that English law allowed employers to organize for their rights, but not employees. He warned against letting merchants and manufacturers influence government policies. And he described those in power in manufacturing and trade as an order of men who have generally an interest to deceive, and even to oppress the public, who have upon many occasions both deceived and oppressed it. Businessmen, he said, seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. But he also believed strongly in private property because it stimulated enterprise. And he also believed that the number of jobs available and the wages paid depended above all else on the accumulation of capital. Still, he stressed that high wages were profitable to both the employer and the employee alike, and he also urged the abolition of slavery, from the economic point of view, as he put it, that Work done by free men comes cheaper in the end than that performed by slaves. Although Smith believed in the basic selfishness and greed of business leaders, he also firmly believed that in seeking their own self-interest, they are led by what he called an invisible hand to promote the well-being of society, without knowing it and without intending it. Competition would lead them to supply goods the public wants, to produce those goods efficiently, and to charge only what they are worth. All of this would happen naturally, without control or regulation. Monopolies to Smith were the biggest evil, because they destroyed competition, which was in the best interests of society. There was, on a highest level, what Smith called a natural course of things, or the natural progress of things toward improvement. The principle behind this natural course was what he described as the uniform, uninterrupted effort of every man to better himself. This effort, based on self-interest, is what drives society, and it's the duty of government and all others to accept it and support it. The fact that Adam Smith saw self-interest as ultimately beneficial, and that it stimulated the economy for all, is one of the most controversial theories in his book. In a famous passage, he wrote, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantage." Once he established this idea of the value of self-interest, it was happily called up by wealthy and powerful manufacturers and industrialists looking for a way to justify their methods. It's very doubtful that this is what Smith himself intended. He did not favor the uncontrolled pursuit of self-interest. He thought, in fact, that most people, farmers, workers, bankers, and manufacturers, failed to recognize what their real self-interests were. Leaders in trade, for instance, had set up a heavy duty on certain goods to protect their profit, which in turn caused a smuggling of those goods that almost ruined their business. It was the long-range effect of their methods, and not the short-term effects, that really served their self-interest. And Smith felt business people seldom realized this. They desired gain at the expense of the general good, and ultimately, therefore, at the expense of their own eventual good. The influence of Smith's book was almost immediate. When British statesman William Pitt the Younger reduced the duty on tea from 119 to 12.5% and pushed through Parliament a free trade agreement with France, he acknowledged that he'd been influenced by the wealth of nations. At a dinner attended by Pitt, the entire company rose when Smith entered the room late and apologized for his tardiness. Pitt, who was in the company of some of the most eminent people in London, including Lord Grenville and the English poet and essayist Joseph Addison, commented, "We will stand till you are seated, for we are all your scholars." Unlike the work of many social philosophers, Smith's has withstood the test of time. Even though he was writing for his own generation, the depth of his knowledge and the boldness of his vision has continued to make him popular with modern social scientists and economists. His philosophy was the very epitome of the Age of Enlightenment, hopeful but realistic, idealistic but practical, and respectful of the past while at the same time committed to progress. He raised economics from what had been called a dismal science to the level of philosophy. Before him, the study of human nature had focused on religion, theology, and life in the hereafter. But Smith shifted it to a study of the pursuit of happiness in the worldly common life. It was the dawn of the industrial age, a time when human problems had increasingly more to do with life in the complex world of commerce. At precisely the right moment, he came along with a guide to those problems by developing the first materialist model of society. Thus came into existence the modern science of economics.